interpretations that have been taking place, myself being one of them, trying to reinterpret the whole controversy. Now, we need to understand that the Hertogh riots was not a local event. Rather, it should be located within the whole larger context of decolonization. A lot of the countries in Southeast Asia had already declared themselves as independent. Burma was independent in 1948. Indonesia was independent in 1949, whichever date that you want to take. They would claim 1945, but really the Dutch basically left in 1949. A lot of these countries were entering into a stage of what has been called as third world nationalism. So it was an electrifying context where there were a lot of liberation movements on the ground. There were a lot of movement in between the borders. So if today we are thinking about people coming and out using passports, there were passports then. But anybody and everybody, if anyone here has relatives who have worked in the Singapore customs, my mother was a Singapore customs officer, could come into Singapore borders through Clifford Pier. That was basically the hub of smuggling. Take note, Singapore was a smuggling hub all the way up until the 1970s. So all of this was happening around Singapore. There was a lot of liberation movements coming in and out, and there was a lot of calls for social justice. Hence, we need to somehow inform our students that this issue is not a case of a court case gone wrong. Rather, it is an issue that should be located within this larger context of people who just unhappy with the Dutch, the British, the Americans who are in the Philippines, basically against the colonization of Southeast Asia. So that's the first thing, this decolonizing moment that we need to register. And I have written about this. My teacher in the history department in the past, Professor Yong Man Chong, I'm sure some of you who have taken history in NUS before would have known him, had written a book on the Indonesian Revolution and how Singapore was part of the Indonesian Revolution. Many of the Indonesian revolutionaries and those who did not go back to Indonesia after Indonesia was declared independent were here in Singapore. My other book, Radicals, Resistance and Protest in Colonial Malaya, also showed that many of these people were involved in newspapers, who were involved in local organizations, in pugilistic groups. They were all part of this resistance against colonial powers. And they were very radical. The Malays, the Chinese would call themselves people of the left, golongan kiri, as they say in Malay. And they were always looking for any episode to bring about issues that could, in their minds, bring about a revolution in Singapore. Of course, none of these revolutions actually happened. The second thing that we need to somehow inform our students is that Singapore has always been a globalized terrain. And that's why the localization perspective is very, very problematic. Very early in our history, we are already very networked. Singapore basically has the most high-tech, in a sense, communications in comparison to other countries within Southeast Asia. Then a lot of the local events were actually shaped by global issues. So we need to see this intersection that was happening between the local and the global. Take note that the Hertogh riots was not the first riots that happened in the British Empire after the Second World War. There were riots in places like Accra, in Kenya, in Uganda, in many of the British former colonies. And these riots were also spurred partly by these anti-British sentiments. And Singaporeans were very much informed by it. You see, the level of literacy in Singapore was basically much higher than other parts of Southeast Asia. And more importantly, for the people who couldn't read, there was a practice of people reading the Chow Pao and the Siang Pao in coffee shop aloud to other people. Many of us, I'm sure, didn't live in that era where people were reading newspapers to everyone to hear, for the people who couldn't hear. And like I said just now, there was this movement of people from different parts of the world into Southeast Asia. So aside from decolonization, we need to look at Singapore from a global perspective. And this, I think, would interest the students a lot. They can see that all these things that are happening right now, social media, digital technologies, all of this actually existed then. People were very much aware of things that were happening all over the world. They didn't have the internet, but they had telegrams. They didn't have Yahoo News, but they had newspapers. There were all these periodicals that were going around, and soon enough, the radio technology became even better. People were listening to the radio every other day for the latest news. And of course, there were other factors. So a few things that we need to emphasize to our students is that there was what we call as colonial neglect. The British were not really concerned with their colonies then. And because of it, if you look at the pictures of old kampongs, and I would encourage you to show to your students pictures of old kampongs, especially where you stayed before. I was in Jalan Eunos. The kampongs were basically badly taken care of. Poor sanitation, there was a problem of cholera, thyroid, smallpox, polio, and all kinds of diseases. And this neglect caused a lot of societal frustration. And it also led to mistrust. When the government doesn't do enough for the people then take things into their own hands. They knew that the colonial powers were not concerned with what was happening on the ground. They were concerned only about maintaining power in society. And because of this, you see the creation of a community of suffering. And this was especially so for the Malays. And the reason is because many of these Malays, now we know them as Malays, they were actually people who came from other parts of Southeast Asia. Poor people from Indonesia, from Malaysia, from other parts of the whole Southeast Asian region, coming here, living in poverty, and not being taken care of in their respective kampongs. For some of you here who are already in your 50s and your 60s, I'm sure you can remember some of these kampongs in Geylang areas. And many of these kampongs were filled with gangsters. So the Salakau, Chapwe, Kompwe, all the kind of numbers were there. And these secret societies flourished precisely because the states did not ensure some kind of enforcement and law and order. So Singapore was not lawless, but it was certainly law at the level of the grassroots. People can basically take the law into their own hands, right? And we need to inform students this, because the riots couldn't have happened that easily and couldn't have spread so quickly if not for the lawlessness that was there, and if it's not for the suffering that was taking place on the ground. And that's why in my PhD thesis, what I did was to look at where the riots basically broke out. So if you look at this map, for example, the places where the riots broke out were places where there were most gangsters there, secret societies, Malays, Chinese, Indians, and others. There were the poorest people also there, and there were people who were waiting for action. So the riots basically started or began in the Supreme Court area, but the Supreme Court area was not the main place of action. It was at Jalan Sultan, Arab Street. So now you can enjoy good biryani and all these things. Take note that the biryani that you like to buy, which is Zamzam restaurant, the owner of Zamzam restaurant was one of the people who helped the rioters, the initial owner. And I wrote this in my book. He basically gave biryani for them. Okay, come eat biryani first and then go out and fight. That was pretty normal then. Tare, and then you can go and fight. The other area is here, Lavender Street, now Lavender MRT. That was a place where, as you can see the word here, rumah miskin, that means poor homes for people who are travelers. They used to stay in these places where people would band together, 30, 40 people in one home. And then Geylang, like I said just now, the hub of gangsterism. Kampung Java, which is a rather affluent area, but there were big kampungs there. If you all know Farrer Park and now Kandang Kerbau Hospital, adjacent to Kampang, the current Kandang Kerbau Hospital was basically like a ghetto in the past. And then Newton Circus, which is also another place where even though there are rich people there, there were also poor people traveling around the area. So these people who are staying here in Kampung Java basically hunt down the Orang Putih, the white people who were staying in Newton Circus. So when you look at the spread of the riots, you can somehow understand the demography of the people who were involved, right? These are basically people who are disenfranchised, waiting for action and going to places where they can find people whom they can attack. And the other place, of course, Orchard Road. If you want to find white people then, as it is now, you go to River Valley Road, and Orchard Road, and you can get some of them, and then they would throw them in the drains and things like that, right? So now I would like to also have a discussion again. Other than these issues that I've raised, what other aspects of the Mara Hertogh riots that you can actually reinterpret?